This one is being recorded. Welcome everyone. This webinar is organized by the Ethics Working Group of the International and Canadian Child Rights Partnership. All through this week, we've been hosting different generations from around the world, reflecting on a range of issues, from methodologies to policy issues involving young people and working together with adults. And today we're going to tackle issues of compensation. Let me start by introducing myself briefly. My name is Mónica Ruiz-Casares. I'm a professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at Toronto Metropolitan University in Canada. And I am also a member of the steering committee and the ethics working group co-led with Kate Tisdall. You will meet her shortly, and at the ICCRP. Let me just go quickly through some housekeeping elements to make sure everybody can participate well in the webinar. You can enable captions in your preferred language if you click in the Show Captions button below, and you can select the language that you desire to hear it on. We're going to have the panel in English and Spanish, so it's important that you select the language that you understand best. We know translation will not be perfect. We're using AI. We'll try to speak slowly, but we're going to go for it. The chat is alive, as you can see. We welcome you to introduce yourselves. Thank you to those who are already doing that. And if you have any technical issues, please use the chat to let us know. For questions and comments, if you can please send them using the Q&A box, that'd be very helpful. And we'll make sure to bring them to the attention of the speakers. And if you're on Instagram or social media, we encourage you to post as we go and or at the end, so we can stir some waves and amplify the conversation. Okay, so now down to business. We know that increasingly young people and children are involved in research, and not just as respondents, but increasingly as co-researchers. We also call it co-production, co-design, where children and young people collaborate with adult researchers in making decisions along the way throughout the research cycle, from the questions to the methods to the analysis and dissemination. But there are a number of ethical issues that emerge when we work side by side, and some of those dilemmas involve payment, compensation, reward, and that's what we're hoping to discuss here. In the context of our work, we're defining children as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child does it up to of young people at to the age of 18 years. But of course, we will be talking about a number of cases that cross over into youth, so a bit past 18 years. That's a little bit as an intro. We have a wonderful panel of presenters, and the session will follow this order. First, we have a brief introduction from Professor Tara Collins, who is a professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at Toronto Metropolitan University and the principal investigator of the International and Canadian Child Rights Partnership. Then Kate Tisdall, a professor in the University of Edinburgh, will introduce co-production and the issues of compensation for us to provide a framework. I will briefly share results from an event that the ICCRP held last summer, and where we asked the participants about payment and compensation. And then we'll have an excellent panel that Kay will chair. And we'll take questions from all of you at the end. Actually, there will be quite a bit of time for that, so please take notes as we go of questions and put them in the Q&A box. So that's enough for me. I'm gonna let Tara Collins introduce the ICCRP for all of you. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you so much, Monica. Hola, bonjour. So great to see all of you zooming in from different parts of the world to participate in this important webinar together with us. And just briefly to give you an introduction to the International and Canadian Child Rights Partnership, the ICCRP. We are a collaborative international research partnership that includes hundreds of children and young people with lived experiences in different locations around the world. We have a large number of case studies and evaluations touching on different aspects of children's rights. We have 40 researchers, a large number of research assistants at various stages of their post-secondary journeys, as well as our partner organizations who are critical to our partnership and supporting the work that we do. So we are guided by an intergenerational advisory committee, which will be having its next roundtable this coming Saturday. We encourage you to check that out as well. And we have the amazing support of an international steering committee, including both Kay and Monica in this webinar, and some dear colleagues in the participant list as well. And such partnerships are really important to address these complex challenges and problems that transcend borders, and we're looking to bring about innovation and support global knowledge exchange, and this webinar is an example of one of those efforts. And then we'll go to the next slide, Michelle, please. So just briefly, our 4 key research objectives are to expand conceptual models for intergenerational partnerships, to explore processes in relation to these partnerships, including child and youth activism. We are also identifying, developing relational practices to support research, policy, and practice, and explore child rights education and environments. And all of these objectives are dedicated to our partnership goal of fostering equitable intergenerational partnerships to support children's rights implementation in research, policy, and practice. And so we'll go to the next slide, Michelle, please. And here we have an image from a video from the gathering that Monica is referred to earlier, and we'll be discussing some results from later. And we encourage you to check that out. It gives you a better sense of who a number of us are, and this, along with a whole range of other images, videos, newsletters, and publications and documents are all available on our website. So we encourage you to check that out. And next slide, Michelle. I'll just share with you a snapshot of our valued partner organizations. Without these partners contributing in such incredibly valuable ways, they're local, national, regional, and international partners. They are really key to the success of our work. And if anyone's interested in joining the partnership, please don't hesitate to join, to reach out, and we can explore it further. We're always growing and always interested in advancing our collaboration with many more organizations and individuals. So thanks so much. Next slide, Michelle.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Tara. We're gonna, if that's okay, Kay, can we take a little poll to see who's in the room? People have been introducing themselves. This is wonderful. We don't quite see you, but we feel your presence. Feels a little bit like Star Wars-y comment, but anyhow, we feel the force in the room. We'd like to know who are, what is your experience working with young people? And so we're gonna launch a couple of questions. If you would please participate and share your experience. Stephen, can we have the first question launched? Okay, can everybody see? Have you ever conducted or participated in research or projects involving children and young people? You can select more than one. Thank you. This is moving. Thank you. All right. I'll give a few seconds more for people to participate. All right. When it stops moving, then I can close it. Okay, some people still participating. All right, there we go. Can everybody see the results if I share them? Okay, so it seems like we have a pretty experienced group here who have worked with young people, both as participants and as part of the organizing team of the research team. But we also have some people who feel a little bit newer to the conversation, but very happy to have you. And this is the beginning when that curiosity brings you in. That's wonderful. Okay, can we get the second question going, please? All right. How should we recognize or compensate children and young people for their active contributions to research or projects? Again, you can select more than one. Go ahead. This is a really interesting question. And it's moving. Let's see. All right. Couple more. Any more? 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's go and share the results. Here we go. So a range, which represents a bit what we saw in our group as well, of monetary rewards, as well as other type of material and non-material compensations, public acknowledgement big, no compensation necessary as well, and other. That other makes me wonder, and maybe during the Q&A period, some of you want to share some of your responses or your experiences. I hope we have a lot of time to hear from your experiences. That'd be wonderful. Okay, well, thank you for playing. I guess I have to stop it, and that's it, and keep us going. Maybe, Michelle, if you don't mind putting back the slide, we're gonna have Kay Tisdall from the University of Edinburgh presenting next. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Kay.
Thank you. And is my sound good? Does it all sound fine? Great. So that was an excellent segue indeed into the next two presentations, Monica? And first, I'm to give one that's from an adult perspective and from an adult team, that I am part of the ethics working group, as Tara and Monica mentioned. And we've been thinking about what we feel are tricky issues around compensation or payment or rewards for children and young people who are involved with what we're currently calling co-research. So Monica mentioned that, but maybe just to say a bit more, it goes under different terminology as far as I'm aware. Things like co-design or co-production or sometimes participatory action research, but it's when children and young people might be research participants, but they're also involved in other roles, roles around co-research that might be about research design, determining the actual questions, etc., to fieldwork analysis, and indeed engagement and dissemination. So a real focus around co-research and what are the tricky issues in that regard in terms of compensation and payment. So on the slide, just to acknowledge there's a group of us who've been doing some thinking around a journal article, and I'll be drawing on that in the presentation, but equally anything that they disagree with is completely my fault. So there will no doubt be a bias in the presentation that indeed Nicole's on the panel, and we can get into that kind of discussion. So for the next few minutes, in the next slide, please, thank you, Michelle, just to draw on three aspects of that article. So just to note things from our review of the literature, what can we find out from that? There are very common typologies when you look in the literature, and we're going to look at these categories that are very commonly cited of the different categories of compensation when you're involving participants in research. And then lastly, the questions that arise from considering those. So next slide, I think. Michelle, thank you. So what does the literature say? In short, I think there's consensus, there's no consensus. A lot of the literature says that there are a lot of different views in this, and it isn't decided. And even to the extent that there isn't consensus, I think even within our team, let alone the literature, about what words to use in regards to it and the weight that the different words have in terms of what they mean. As I was saying, and we'll come back to, there are much cited typologies that are used at different categories in terms of looking at how people should and could consider payment or compensation. I think we were very struck that much of the literature that we were able to access was from the health context, and particularly American clinical health research is it's both often cited as well as quite prevalent. And that tends, understandably, to have an emphasis on ethics boards weighing risks and benefits for pediatric clinical research, which for us, I would suggest, is not a complete read over. So when we're talking about co-research, it's not in the context of clinical research, perhaps more affiliated with the social sciences, etc. And fundamentally, most of that literature is about children as research participants, and our interest is in co-research, where children and young people are involved in additional and further ways. In both the academic and grey literature that we were reading and accessing, there's a lot of focus, and helpfully, on practical dilemmas about how to pay children and young people. A lot of concern about what is called undue incentives, like if you pay, etc., does that mean that children and young people are coerced to participate? But the question came to us, as there is no consensus, and a lot of practical dilemmas, was the value of perhaps taking a step back and looking a bit more critically at the assumptions that were behind the categories and the issues. And by doing that, at least ask further questions, but perhaps in the due course being able to build up to something that moves at least the ICCRP along, and well, perhaps to contribute to others. And particularly in the ICCRP context, which as Tara has shown it's cross-national, and it is with social science related research and involving co-research. So now to tip into the typology in the next slide, Michelle. So very commonly cited is Wendler's and colleagues' typology, which is American and does come from clinical health research, in a publication that they did in 2002. And they have 4 categories that they put forward: reimbursement, compensation, appreciation, and incentives. So use that to frame the rediscussion in that regard. So next slide for reimbursement. So as the quotation says, Wendler and colleagues describe reimbursement about compensating parents and children for their direct research-related expenses. So the idea of that the research should make sure people are not out of pocket, to use that term, things like travel or meals, accommodation, childcare, lost wages, etc. So I agree in terms of the ethics research involving children, which is a well-known and respected international website on ethics. And in their guidance, they suggest that such reimbursement is actually essential for social justice. And in that regard, I actually don't think it's a question that we must reimburse such expenses for people's participation. So I'm not even sure it should be in the typology in the same way. But it has been established as a core category in itself. So if that's reimbursement, which I'm arguing is essential for social justice, what about the next 3, which I think there is more to talk about? Second one is compensation, and that is the terminology that Wendler and colleagues, as well as others, use. So this idea is coming from that payment as compensation is required to recognize the time, effort, and inconvenience of participating in research. And we ascertain that there's at least sort of 2 parts of it. So one that actually literally talks about the burdens of participation, and that compensation must compensate for that. The second use, I think, is closer to co-research, and that's when it's about a payment for a skill or service. And the quotation on the slide, I think, is closer to that. That research participation could be equated to other activities like employment, and it's about treating people fairly and avoiding exploitation, particularly when it's socially valuable activities. But, well, I think there are some great examples. Like, I'm fascinated by the McCreary Center Society, which employs young people, or we employed young people recently on mental health network. I would suggest that whole-scale employment of young people is not the common model in co-research across jurisdictions. I would suggest, at least in my experience, that more often children and young people, they might be paid, but they're paid something. So there's a division often between adult researchers who are employed and those with lived experiences who are not employed. So I'll leave that hanging a little bit to compare it to the next category, which is appreciation. And at least in the circles I go in, in this territory is a lot of different issues, and one that is quite commonly referred to in co-research. You can test this in terms of your points in the chat and the panel. But payments as appreciation, as Bradley, Jones, and Taylor argue, are intended to show respect for participants' contributions. We have the quotation on the slide that describes, When Learn All describes these as bonuses given after children's participation to thank them. And the next quotation is from Eric, actually ethics research involving children, who suggests that appreciation payments are bonuses or tokens given to children, again, after their participation, to acknowledge and to thank them. And then that powerful word there about reflecting reciprocity in terms of the children's contributions, and then reciprocity in terms of acknowledging them. So I suggest that such explanations raise questions about what the appreciation payments are paying for. Wording in English aligned to like payment and bonuses seem closer to employment wages, whereas thank you or reciprocity introduces non-transactional possibilities. It's probably only me and the team who's like fascinated by this, but if you're in social policy in the UK, you will have heard of Titmuss, who did this really famous book about the gift relationship in the 1970s. And basically his argument at the time in America, blood donations were paid for, and in the UK, they were not. Yeah, and so in terms of his analysis, that he argued that the British system was better in all ways, actually, economically, medically, and ethically superior because human blood wasn't treated as a commodity. That's the key aspect of the gift relationship. So I think that's interesting in this regard, because when we're thinking about children and young people contributing in that way, are they making a societal contribution like a gift relationship more akin to perhaps volunteering, which again might have expenses reimbursed in some kinds of payments, but essentially it's a form of social contribution? Then the question becomes, then when do these appreciations or thank yous are given? Because you notice in both of the quotes, the emphasis is on after. That makes our ethics committees very happy in the UK, I would say, because then it's not an undue incentive, right? Do the children and young people a thank you, they don't know about it in advance. However, for co-research, arguably that doesn't work very well, right? It's often a longer term kind of relationship over time. When do you give these thank yous? And once you give them, then does it become expected? So does that kind of paradigm, that kind of category work for us? And the last one I just want to touch upon, particularly there's some great practical guidance from the Pacific AIDS Network that we were looking at. And they give a very fulsome list of many things that I'm sure those on the call have considered. Things that feel recognize and give back, things like training, participation in conferences, certification, developing CVs, access to further employment, etc. And then arguably these become less about payment and more about acknowledgement. So I find this discussion quite interesting. So on one hand, does appreciation set up different relationships than with compensation? Are they relationships that are less transactional, but can be justified by social norms or perhaps research or project standards that are about reciprocity and recognition? Yes, and on to incentives. Thank you, Michelle. Incentives is included in the typology. Again, I'll speak from the UK because in our team discussions, I think there's different experiences. But in the UK, I would say that incentives for children and young people, 10 years ago, I couldn't have got it through an ethics committee. But there has been considerable change, I think in part because there's been such a growth of involving children and young people in research. So the arguments certainly from the, say, Wendler and colleagues and others writing about it, which were quite accepting of incentives being there for, in their case, medical research. But the argument was interesting. So for example, an argument that if the medical research was worthwhile in itself, it was a worthwhile social goal, then it was moral, ethical, to make sure you had a sufficient sample to then make the research worthwhile. Yeah. And so if you needed to provide incentives to have the diversity, for example, in the sample that you needed, then incentives could be justified. I guess some of the problems with incentives is a little bit of market supply and demand. I mean, it certainly can determine your cost point, can't it? How much do you need to pay to get enough people into your sample? But does that mean, and I know there's some PhD students on the call, if you don't happen to have a project with a lot of money, are you less deserving and thus have more trouble recruiting children and young people? But the reason why my ethics committees were so disturbed years ago would be the risk of bribery or coercion, a feeling that with those incentives, people would participate who would not have otherwise, and that it is unduly coercive and not really about participants' consent. But just to make sure I do the counter argument, that in fact there is evidence that perhaps this does support particularly those who may be economically more marginal, for example, or other groups who otherwise would not participate. Again, I think it's somewhat similar to thank yous. Where do you give this? Where does that fit in the co-research? And I suppose it's like, well, we don't give incentives usually for the adult researchers to be involved. So if the claims are for co-research, again, it sort of arguably feels a power imbalance that goes against the ethos of co-research, arguably. And I think that's one of our central questions about the positioning of children, young people, and adults. So next slide. If we looked at that kind of typology, I think we felt as the ICCRP authorship group in this, there was a couple of cross-cutting themes that were hard questions. So if you're not sure in what category to pay, it becomes perhaps even harder in a cross-national context to think about how much to pay. How much to pay children and young people, I think, again, arguably intersects with this, where's childhood positioned in relation to adults? But what might seem as a reasonable amount to pay an adult co-researcher might be a fortune for a younger child. What is equitable in terms of pay in that regard? Furthermore, there's discussion in the literature, I'll put it that way because I don't quite agree with it, but what about children and young people being less experienced with money? Or there are also suggestions, well, really the best thing is to pay the parents and the guardians, and thus not having a direct relationship with the child who is the co-researcher and the payment, but a whole question about how much to pay and how to pay. Going on to that in more details and the how to pay, I think people involved in co-research now it's well rehearsed, but yet problematic about how monetary payments can cause problems for certain families or certain young people in terms of welfare, social security benefits. So it's not as straightforward as one might think. And then I get somewhat obsessed because of employment legislation. So while in Scotland, for example, you could hire a 3-year-old as a child actor, you cannot hire them as a child researcher because children under the age of 14 are not allowed to be employed. So there's just baseline things that children, it can be problematic to employ them. Often, then, people give other things like vouchers or gift cards. Often that fits, for example, into our organizational processes quite well, because otherwise we want to pay things into bank accounts, and often children and young people don't have a bank account. But vouchers, I don't know about your experience, we'd love to hear them, are not necessarily so straightforward. So they are for marketized goods. Even if you get ones that are quite general, we often find it's still an issue of children and young people's access to the places and stores to get them. So vouchers we haven't found necessarily straightforward. And then I was just actually in a discussion with people sorting this out and get to a ridiculous kind of thing about how many amounts of vouchers can you actually give, and where does that again fit with benefits? And the third point we just wanted to touch about, and we're really learning across the ICCRP, is the impact of the context. So there's a great case study actually on Eric that talks about how in a particular context in Malawi, it was not culturally appropriate. It was felt by the research team to give individualized thank yous to the children, that it was really important to provide community food, entertainment, and donations to the village in contrast. With some similarities, we have one of our case studies of child activists has an organizational policy. This is a part of the ICCRP, where again, they do not give individualized payments or money or vouchers. They work on a group thing. So they will fund fun activities, bowling is very popular, rather than individual payments. But there's other groups involved in the ICCRP who take a very different approach, and we might be hearing about that today. And even if you go down, well, whatever route, how do you consider equity cross-culturally? So if you just went by payment, minimum hourly wage in Canada is very different than a minimum hourly wage with our colleagues in South Africa. And if we have children and young people working together in amazing ways, like you'd see in the video, how do you create equity and fairness when there are those differences in local economies and contexts? So I suggest it really raises questions about the positioning of children, payment amount and method, and how to ensure equity across that kind of diversity. So to conclude, there is much more we could take from this, and I hope the panel and the rest of the webinar will do it. But I sort of suggest, and just the next slide, Michelle, if that's okay, is I'm a childhood studies person, so we'd always say, you know, it goes back to constructions of childhood and adulthood and what roles children and young people, how we're constructing that in terms of research. By looking at these categories, I suggest there's different ways we're seeing them. Are they considered as equal partners to the other adults and the research team members, and thus should be paid and have equitable pay? Or instead, remembering the famous titmus gift relationships, are they volunteers motivated by social contribution who should receive support and training to enable the volunteering role? Or sometimes in the writing, I feel they're almost regarded as super participants, similar to children and young people who might participate, say, in a research interview, but just involved in more ways. In that case, is it ethically appropriate to primarily recognize their contributions through including them in authorship? Questions of payment, I think we probably feel as a team, highlight that co-producing research is not a panacea for power relationships. And fundamentally, money matters, and who decides how the money gets spent is a powerful position indeed. So we're really glad now in ICCRP has started that we're actually engaging with the children and young people who are part of the ICCRP to work this out together and to get their views. So I think that's a hand over to Mónica, who's going to share with us some initial views from the children and young people, as well as the adults involved. And where do we get to with thinking about compensation? So thank you, and over to you, Mónica.
Thank you, Kay. That's excellent. We're going to do hopefully a very smooth transition here. Can everybody see the next slide, my slide? Okay, and thank you. I see there are already some questions coming up in the Q&A. That's excellent. We will be addressing those at the end of the panel. So please keep taking notes and putting them in the box. In the next few minutes, I've been tasked with sharing work that we did during this event, partnership event we had in July, where a number of ICCRP members, including members of the Intergenerational Advisory Committee, as well as working groups, case studies got together. And the work I will be presenting actually was developed with members of the Ethics Working Group. And this particular presentation builds on analysis that I developed with Elisar Heider. She did a lot of the work here. She's a young person, a JD student at the University of Ottawa, and a research assistant with the ICCRP. So this is what we found out when we asked, you see here our beautiful ethics tree, when we asked questions about compensation. This was a lovely summer morning where we posted our questions. Every morning we would post an ethics question. And today we will focus specifically on, and you saw here how we used color coding. This is kind of the analysis element. We gave those flowers for 3 different groups. The one color for participants up to the age of, well, I guess 17 years. Then another one 18 to 29, and then for 30 and above. So the color coding helped us later. We posted the question in 3 languages because we were working across Spanish, Portuguese, and English, and that's where you see the white sheets of paper. And the question that we want to share with you today, the results to, is actually, how should we recognize or reward children and young people's contribution to research? More broadly, we wanted to know how to facilitate young people's participation in research, but specifically, as Kate just presented, how do we then acknowledge their contributions? First, let me present kind of in aggregate what we learned. We learned that about half of the responses mentioned monetary compensation, and this included either pay or a salary, or either specifically or implicitly through comparison to adult researchers, gift cards and or vouchers, honorarium, compensating out-of-pocket expenses, and in some cases just monetary compensation, not specifically any particular kind. Also, almost slightly lower. I mean, I didn't want to put percentages, it was, 47%, but it's almost half of the responses stated that acknowledgement and credit was appropriate form of compensation, very often combined with other type of compensation. And several responses mentioned compensation in the form of certification, mentorship certification, work references, networking, the kinds of things that we just heard in the previous presentation. And then 1 in 3 people or responses, each person was supposed to fill in 1 flower, suggested a combination of monetary and non-monetary compensation. Now, let's break it down because we have 3 different groups. So out of our 36 entries, we had, this is the distribution, we had 9 participants under the age of 18, 8 up to 30, and then 30 and beyond. The respondents from the age 10 to 17 were most likely to mention acknowledgement in research, actually, compared to the other groups. They were also most likely to mention monetary compensation exclusively as a way to reward young people. The respondents in the 18 to 29 age group, they, as a whole, prioritize acknowledgement and credit. And the older participants were most likely to suggest a combination of monetary and non-monetary compensations. They were also the only ones to mention certain concerns, such as the implications for monetary compensation when children and young people who are from more economically marginal communities are involved in research, and also issues connected to the benefits of research as a reward on its own, as well as issues of reciprocity. Now, we wanted to zoom in, you see here, this is a kind of in a graphic representation. I just highlight a couple of things. First is acknowledgement in research that was mentioned most by all age groups, partly connected to environment and support. That's, you see, another theme that came out as we thematically analyzed those responses. But basically, highlighting the importance of recognizing children and young people contributions to the research endeavor in a range of ways in any outputs throughout the process. So really acknowledging their contributions. The children and young people monetary compensation came up next as the most frequently cited theme by young people, again, in a range of forms, as I mentioned earlier. There were also a couple of other themes that emerged from the contributions of, actually, in this case, of the youngest and the oldest age groups, but not the in-between group, that were the dialogue with children and young people and cultural concerns. And I'll illustrate those points now with quotes that come directly from children and young people. So here we have some quotes that come directly, as I say, from the text. Some of them, of course, were translated and all of them were denominalized. So we heard that young people need to be compensated. They need to be paid for the time and energy. It might be in some sort of gift cards of money. I also think that they should have the options to be mentioned in published work. And also reward children and young people the same as their adult counterparts to prevent them from being infantilized. These are quotes that come all from the youngest age group, the 10 to 17-year-old. I mentioned how there were references to culture, and also this idea of dignity came up a few times. So it depends. You need to take into account the context, as Kay was saying earlier. And especially when intergenerational and intercultural, there's no easy answer. Speak to the children and young people. This is something that seems so simple, but we tend to forget. Really, like, engage in that conversation. And reward children with honoring their dignity. Ask for their consent. Another way would be to use their names, give them the credit if they give you the permission. So this idea of asking, again, seems so simple, but we don't always do it. So my first thought is to ask them how they want to be recognized. And this is something that we're engaging in at the ICCRP, and I'm sure you are as well in your own work. I think it also depends on the type of research. It could be a pseudonym, to change the real name, or faces, videos, photos. We had another question, actually, another morning when we were asking them about what about using images of people, of young people who participate? Is that okay or not? So all keeping in mind what the children and young people, what they want and what reduces risk for them. And the first and most basic step is to include the names in the official documents. As for the rest, I believe it's best to ask the children. So in conclusion, I really want to pass on to the panel to bring to life some of these perspectives and new perspectives. First is that the responses were mostly concerned with the agency of involving children and young people. Also, paying attention to ensuring that whatever recognition or reward is appropriate for a particular context. We're living that day to day as is an international collaboration partnership, but even within the same location, we could have diversity of circumstances, and that's what equity calls for. And the importance of engaging in dialogue with the children and young people involved, allowing them to shape their conversation. So we're gonna pass on now. I'll stop sharing and we will, I see there's still there are comments coming in. Just before I pass on the the word to Kay and to introduce our panelists. Just to remember, a reminder for everyone that you can enable captions in your preferred language by clicking the Show Captions button at the bottom of the screen and selecting the language that you want to hear the panelists in. The panelists can speak in English and in Spanish. Thank you. Kay, I'll let you introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I'm delighted to be chairing the panel now. I can already see 3 questions that are up, and please do use either the chat or the question and answer. And also, I'm very aware there's people with such expertise as well with the group. So please also share that and your ideas. So yes, a chance to have a bit of a conversation, discuss and share. So the format is, shortly the panelists are going to briefly introduce themselves, and also the wonderful Michelle A. will put some further biographies in the chat. We've got a couple of starter questions or 2, and then we'll indeed pick up some of the points already there and others that you want to ask for a discussion in the next half an hour, 20 minutes or so. So that's our plan. Does that sound good, panelists? Great. Well, shall I hand over to Nicole first? And do you want to give a brief biography and then pass it on to somebody else? So over to you, Nicole.
Thanks, Kay. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole D'Souza. I am a health systems researcher, working mainly in child and youth mental health. And I'm currently embedded as a researcher in a charity called jack.org, which we'll talk a little bit about further on. And in this context, we've had lots of conversations about compensation and involvement of young people in developing programming, in engaging in research. And so super excited to have this discussion with everyone, especially with Saria, who I'm going to pass on for the introduction, who I have had the pleasure of closely working with in this space.
Hello, everyone. My name is Saria James Thomas. I am currently an undergraduate student at the University of Calgary. My research interests center on child mental health, but mainly focusing on equity-deserving youth. And like Nicole said, I've had the privilege of working with her in the jack.org space as well through research and as well as being one of the network representatives of the organization. And I'll pass it on to Michelle S.
Bueno, hola, mi nombre es Michelle Soliz, soy psicóloga social y actualmente trabajo como responsable de implementación de proyectos en Act Together Bolivia, el cual es un proyecto de Learning for Wellbeing Foundation. Gracias.
Wonderful. And my translation is working. I hope it's working for everybody as well if you happen not to speak Spanish. So if not, put it in the chat and we'll try to help. So, but thank you, everybody. So our starter question, and maybe we'll go around in the same order if that suits. It is, from your perspective, why should children and young people be compensated if they're co-researchers? Nicole, what do you think?
Well, Kate, we've had lots of conversations about this, and I think for this particular question, I wanted to speak to a specific context. And so when we're thinking about co-research and we're thinking about working with young people, one thing to consider is that in terms of co-research, young people are now working on these projects with us for a longer duration than if they were just participants. That's one. 2, the way that research ethics boards have set up this idea of what is important in terms of undue influence and confidentiality and all those things are really, I guess, embedded in this idea of research as experimental, or if we think about how traditional research models have been built, it was to ask a research question, see if it is a valid question, and then have the ability to replicate it. When we're now moving into research that considers lived and living experiences and building that into how we understand the world and whose knowledge is important and what counts, those models are not as common or as valuable anymore. We're not trying to replicate. We're not trying to generalize. We're trying to understand some of the very concrete lived experiences of certain populations that we're working with. In this case, I think that when we work with young people as partners in developing the appropriate questions, in figuring out what matters to them, it would be absolutely appropriate to compensate them just as any other member of a research team. And those questions of undue influence are not as important in this context of the type of research we're doing.
Thank you for so eloquently putting it that far and making some connections for us. Saria, do you want to go next? Why should we compensate children and young people in co-research?
So I completely agree with Nicole. Like, I am a young person who's been involved in a plethora of research projects, some of which I've been compensated for and others which I have not. Many of these research projects take a significant amount of time, some of which actually are equivalent to more than a part-time job. I know there's the argument that maybe the young person doesn't have as much experience, so they don't have to be compensated as much. But even in that context, like, a lot of the time the young person is teaching themselves how to do the different and learning different things, like teaching themselves the different steps of the research process. So they have to invest even more time, which requires, like, I feel like some form of compensation. It doesn't have to be monetary, but they are putting in as much effort, sometimes even more than the primary researcher, into the research project, which the primary researcher would get compensated. So the young person should also receive something for their time.
Thank you. And I think it's really interesting you talking from your different experiences of being involved in co-research, Saria. So great. We'll maybe come back to that. Michelle S., why should we compensate children and young people?
Gracias, Kay. Bueno, para responder esta pregunta creo que es muy importante primero entender el contexto que ahora mismo represento. Estamos hablando de un contexto latinoamericano, boliviano, donde hay muchos aspectos diferentes en cuanto a la investigación. Primero, como saben, Latinoamérica y bueno, sobre todo Bolivia es un país en desarrollo que tiene muchas limitaciones y la pobreza es un factor bien importante. Entonces, las investigaciones mayormente van a centrarse en investigar y trabajar en los sectores vulnerables. Entonces estaríamos hablando que los niños que participan en espacios de investigación, que son muy poquitos y reducidos, porque entre esos la investigación y con niños no es una prioridad en Bolivia, se centran sobre todo en esta población vulnerable, ¿no? Por otro lado, es también importante entender que en el contexto boliviano, la ley habla del trabajo infantil validado igual desde los 14 años, y que eso hace que muchos niños trabajen en diferentes lugares, muchos en lugares de riesgo y otros sí en lugares menos peligrosos, ¿no? Y por otro lado, al ser también que estas investigaciones se centran en niños que trabajan, que son de situaciones vulnerables, muchas veces las compensaciones están centradas en cubrir necesidades básicas para que estos niños puedan participar, ¿no? Entonces ahí, por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos un casito muy pequeño que va a que en unos días tenemos un evento donde estamos pagando la participación de líderes de toda Bolivia para que ellos puedan participar. Entonces cubrimos sus viáticos, alimentación, transporte, que puede ser visto eso desde una forma de compensación. Pero justo tenemos el caso particular de un niño que nos llama y que nos dice que él no va a poder participar porque su papá no cuenta con los recursos para poder hacer que él venga a participar. Entonces ahí nos abre una nueva problemática que va más allá de la compensación, sino a limitar o no la participación del niño, ¿no? Entonces, A eso me refiero, que los proyectos y los presupuestos de investigación se van a centrar tal vez en cubrir las necesidades y que va a dejar de lado y va a hacer que sea un poco imposible cubrir la compensación desde otros aspectos. Entonces, ahí surgen dos preguntas que las quiero así como poner en mesa antes de poder ver cómo las resolvemos. Es, por un lado, entender si la compensación va a ser la que habilite la participación de los niños en estos espacios, o es la compensación lo que viene después a reconocer ya a quienes participan. Pero creo que ambas preguntas generan nuevas dificultades que las podemos ir como charlando un poquito más adelante.
Thank you, Michelle. And you've already gone on to so helpfully our next sort of question that we had already considered for the panel. So with that, I think Nicole and Saria, we're going to encourage you to talk about how you've negotiated quite recently Saria's continued involvement with the project. Over to you two to share how that got negotiated. What was tricky? What did you find the solutions?
Sure, thanks, Kay. So to give a little bit of context, Jack.org is a Canadian charity working in the space of youth mental health. I think you can find the link in the chat. Essentially, because they are a charity, research is not a function of the work that they do. The priority for the organization is to build programs that are valuable for young people in Canada. One of the strategic priorities of the organization was that after investigation, they saw that equity-deserving young people in the Canadian context were not using their programs. And so they wanted to work to figure out why young people from certain groups, Indigenous and Black, were not using or harnessing the programs that were out there. And so that required some internal research and engagement with different young people within the organization, and then also those external to the organization. So that's a little bit of the context of the organization and the work that we're doing. And then Saria. So one of the things that Jack.org does is that they have summer internships, not for research, but just for young people who are interested to know how this work of advocacy for mental health is able to move forward. They give summer internship positions to young people to be placed in different departments. One of the departments was research and evaluation. And so Saria was embedded in this context of coming on to work on research, which is not a priority at Jack.org. And also it was because that was her interest to understand a little bit more about research. As you all know, because there might be a lot of researchers on this call, research projects are not just 4 months in duration. A lot of the projects that are answering questions that get to the core of many different issues, particularly the social determinants of health, are long in nature. And so Saria's position of working with us to co-produce the questions that mattered, to engage in the analysis of the data, and then also to present and disseminate the findings would be beyond the 4-month internship. The internships at the charity are paid. Beyond that, what happened was in all the duration of previous internships, they come to an end. Well, at the end of summer, I guess this is where I then will pass the mic to Saria, but basically at the end of summer, we came to a situation where it's like, well, we're continuing this research. Saria, your time with us has come to an end. Now what? And so maybe Saria, did you want to speak a little bit more about that process?
Yes, so for sure. So as Nicole said, I started in an intern type role. Within this role, I was compensated using money. Now, initially, when I had reached out to Jack.org asking for this opportunity, I had not expected to be compensated in any form, as I thought because I was trying to develop new skills and develop CV skills that maybe my time wasn't worthy of compensation. So when I had heard that, oh, compensation was involved, it kind of surprised me in a way. It made me feel valued because it's like, oh, you actually like care about the work that I'm putting in. Now getting to the part where that internship ended, we had to negotiate a contract. Again, I had not expected this because I just assumed at this point that I would continue working for free. However, Nicole really advocated for me, as well as Jack.org themselves. They kept checking in with me, being like, are you okay with not being financially compensated? And this was a lot of back and forth. It wasn't just one, oh, are you okay with it? They checked in with me multiple times. Multiple people checked in with me. I had meetings to make sure that I was okay with this. And although I wasn't being financially compensated after this internship role, we switched to negotiating another way that I could be compensated with co-authorship. So in our contract, we negotiated that if I contribute roughly about 25% of the work, I will get a co-authorship place on the publication, which I think is pretty appropriate. I think it's very important that this contract was made because a lot of times when it comes to like monetary contributions ending and like these more not intangible, but these types of compensation coming into the picture, youth are up in arms about what they'll receive at the end of their contribution. So I think that was really appropriate in just providing clarity and transparency in the whole process of compensation.
The one thing I would like to also add to this is that although Saria's work is very defined in terms of the research project, what we did was that it moved beyond just the small research group. We got Jack.org involved in a formal contract to understand that we ourselves, as the research team within the organization, had something to speak to if we didn't keep up our end of the bargain. And this was a contract that was made with the organization, with the research team involved, and then also with the young people involved. And this was something that Jack.org had never done before. And so this is a new area of, I guess, a new pathway forward in terms of organizations, NGOs, not-for-profits, charities that usually don't have a mandate for research built in, but would like young people to contribute to the development of their offerings and programs, how that research pathway can be formally built into an organization. So this really helped pave that way for the organization.
Thank you so much. And with the two of you in dialogue, it just came across to me when I first heard about it and hearing again the care that was taken in regards to that, which is all I think, Monica, you often talk about relational ethics and the importance of that. Well, there are several questions in our questions and answers. So shall we have a look at them? One I've unfortunately transferred to the answered call from Eunice, just because I'd love to know a little bit more as well from their perspective. But Michelle A., do you want to read out Eunice's question to the group? Are you able to see it? It's now unanswered.
Yeah. So thank you, Eunice. The question was, has there been consideration for using the term honorarium versus compensation or payment to children for participating in research?
So just let that sink in for translation. Is there anybody on the panel that might want to speak to that? So not leaping up. I mean, Monica, do you want to be an honorary member of the panel? Is there anything you would comment about the use of honorarium?
I think this probably came up as you were presenting, Kay. I don't know if, and I'm going to tap on Nicole and Kay, the literature. So even digging in, I don't know if there might be any disciplinary or cultural, not cultural, but in the sense of different jurisdictions. I know sometimes when we have these conversations, what we see in North America is not exactly what we see in Europe. And so there might be some of that might be those differences. But I mean, my first sense is that it adds up to the stew of terms that get confused, where the boundaries are not always clear. and the intentions and the purpose are not always clearly defined. And some people might call it one way or another, but we might, even ourselves, we've had to sometimes clarify what we meant, because we would call it slightly differently, or our ethics board will call it differently. And as we are seeking, ethics approval for multi-site research, we need to make sure we translate it in terms of that very granular, nuanced use of those terms. So, my reaction is like, sure, we use it sometimes, but if you tell me how is that very different from compensation or from, that gets very fuzzy. I don't know if Nicole can.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. I think context is so important here. And also duration of the project and the ask of engagement. So in terms of not just a research project at a university, but here I'm talking in terms of an organization. When we think about honorarium versus payment, they're very different legal entities. Payments may actually involve having that young person give that fill in a formal employment form. They also would receive, depending on how many hours that they have engaged, contributions for taxes versus an honorarium, which is a decided amount with a decided number of hours in advance. And this may be something with, like you have a certain amount of money that you will be given based on these certain amount of hours. But if we're talking about co-research in long-term projects in which engagement may change from week to week, this is something where these terms, like Monica and Kay pointed out, become really tricky. And I think it really depends on the context and the engagement of the young person, the individuals involved, and the organizations involved. Because if a young person's working on a 5-year project in which they are regularly working, I think it is completely unfair that we call that an honorarium and pay them as an honorarium when the research team are being paid as employees, and their knowledge is being built into the project. It also speaks to this idea of epistemic injustice, especially if we're engaging with populations that voices have not been at the table, and we're asking them now to join those conversations, but we're not giving them the same benefits that others that are sitting at that table are getting. So I think it really depends on context.
Thank you. And does Saria or Michelle S. want to catch my eye? No, we've got 2 other. Yeah, no, you can always come back in. I think the next 2 questions we have actually continue the conversation helpfully. So if we can next go to the one from our colleague Patricio, and I'm just looking at it, and perhaps to summarize, I take it you can all see the questions and answers, or we can put it in the chat. Michelle A., why don't we put it in the chat, should we, in case not everybody can see the question and answer? Are you able to do that?
I will try.
But I think it's creating a contrast, is that right, Patricio, between maybe from an international development perspective, projects engaged in marginalized communities, and it's about enhancing the social fabric of the communities. And Patricia writes, within this context, payment is not always welcome. But there may be difference if it's a research institute that is not of the community, not working in a community, and is seeking to recruit children and young people as co-researchers. In that case, payment might be relevant and expected through a form of monetary allowance. So and then Patricia asks, any thoughts about those 2 cases? Yeah, so one that's maybe embedded in the community, maybe an international development perspective. Is it different, or in what ways different if it's maybe a research institution not from the community? So Saria, is there any starting words you would say in terms of that kind of difference?
Yeah, this is a very, very good question. And I think this comes back down to when we were going back to the presentation, where in this situation, it might be important to ask the youth what they really need and to collaborate with the youth to come to a solution. I think it's important to consider that compensation does not have to be monetary, so that even like if it's embedded in the community, if where monetary contributions may be appreciated but not necessarily accepted, compensation could look differently, and like you may want to collaborate with the youth to figure out what that looks like. But I think an important thing to consider here too is that even though a youth might say, I am okay with not receiving compensation in some form, they could, with like in my personal context, I've said that before just because I didn't have the experience to advocate for myself in saying that I deserve compensation because I may not have had a research experience at that point. So I think it's like what me and Nicole were talking about earlier. I think it's important to have like an in-depth conversation and just like actually like try to check in with the youth and figure out what they really desire to get that compensation.
Thank you so much. Michelle S., is there anything you would comment in reply to Patricio?
Sí, gracias, Kay. Tengo nuevamente como dos lados en esta respuesta, ¿no? Porque por un lado, sí pienso que las compensaciones, sobre todo en los contextos bolivianos, sean internos o externos, siempre van a ser como bienvenidas, pero hay como riesgos bien importantes, ¿no? Uno de ellos es como caer en el asistencialismo, de pensar que yo participo porque me compensan, ¿no? O sea, no participo porque es mi derecho, no participo porque soy un agente que puede aportar en la comunidad. Entonces, el riesgo, desde mi punto de vista, de caer en el asistencialismo es muy grande, sobre todo en países como Bolivia, ¿no? El creer que es una obligación la remuneración y dónde queda un poco esto de la ciudadanía activa, de mi compromiso de participar o de cómo yo me sumo a la participación, ¿no? Pero por el otro lado está la otra cara, de que si no me ayudan con los recursos para que yo pueda participar, realmente no puedo participar, no tengo como otras alternativas porque no tengo los recursos, no tengo los fondos. Entonces, creo que no tengo la respuesta, pero tengo como esta mirada de ambos lados de que es un poco complicado y que hay que como encontrar. Sin embargo, yo considero, y como desde el enfoque que trabajamos desde Learning for Wellbeing, es muy importante los espacios de consulta, poder preguntar a los niños un poco si sus necesidades, los niños son sujetos de derechos, ellos saben lo que necesitan y también brindarles las herramientas para que ellos puedan empoderarse en la participación.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think we have time for 2 more questions if we're relatively quick, and that'd be nice since they're up there. I think a good testing one is maybe about the question about younger children. And Michelle A., do you want to read it out again? It's lovely hearing you say it so eloquently.
From the anonymous attendee, okay? Just to make sure.
Yes.
So thank you for our anonymous attendee. The question is, I appreciate this conversation. As someone working on a project involving children aged 3 to 8, what compensation suggestion should we consider? Also, how would you suggest we navigate ethics for such?
I will build up to answer this question based on some of the responses that Michelle and Saria have already mentioned, where I think it is establishing that starting point. Is the starting point having a budget, and then while you're within the project deciding, okay, now we need to figure out how we use that budget in terms of allocation of resources for compensation, for implementing the research project on the ground, versus what is your starting point? Are young people like children? Are we asking them before we even make decisions about how those budgets will be used? Perhaps for children in a younger age group, financial compensation might not even be something that they are thinking about or even understand what dollars or money mean. And so if we're asking them before decisions can be made formally by the organizations or the research teams, what matters to them. That could help us figure out those timelines and how to allocate the budget appropriately. And if we also, depending on context again, if young people are not the most appropriate to engage in these discussions, to have their caregivers or the organizations involved, the community members involved at that table, making decisions about budget and timeline with the research group before we get to that point where we have to actually talk about compensation.
Thank you, Nicole. Michelle S., is there anything you'd like to add for the younger children? Only if you want to.
Sí, gracias. Justamente actualmente nosotros estamos trabajando en una caja de herramientas para desarrollar la participación en niños de preescolar, ¿no? Que es un proyecto, pero también es una investigación de cómo está funcionando, si funciona la participación en el sistema educativo boliviano, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? En ese sentido, trabajamos directamente con los niños de estas edades, entonces claramente no existe una compensación ni siquiera de estas que podemos hablar de pagarles ningún recurso porque nosotros asistimos a sus aulas, o tampoco menos pensar en una compensación financiera a los niños que están participando, ¿no? Sin embargo, yo pienso que ahí la compensación es mucho más transversal porque el aporte que se hace en involucrar herramientas de participación en el aula es muy beneficioso para niños, y hasta lo que se ha visto en el involucramiento de esta caja de herramientas es cómo ha cambiado el bienestar en el aula, ¿no? Entonces, pienso que ahí no se habla de una compensación directa, pero sí se habla de generar un espacio que mejore el bienestar de los niños dentro del aula. Entonces, pienso que ahí el aporte es muy importante, pero claramente pienso que va a depender de en qué se quiere involucrar a los niños de esta edad, cuánto tiempo les va a tomar y qué papel van a jugar para poder determinar el tema ético respecto a eso.
Thank you. My pause is just the translation was coming through, Michelle. So thank you. And Saria, just invitation not required. Is there anything you'd want to comment about the younger children?
Unfortunately, I don't have experience working with this age group in research, but everything that Michelle and Nicole has said seems to be very comprehensive and it makes much sense.
It does, doesn't it? But also, I think the question's very welcome, because if I could comment, a lot of the discussions when you go cross-nationally are kind of thinking about older children and into youth. And I think if you take a children's rights approach, children are obviously all the way down to at least age 0. So it's an excellent challenge to us, actually, if we're only concentrating on older young people. Is that a form of discrimination in itself? And maybe with that, we have a lovely last question, which might just be a call for more work from Sarah. I took the time to put it in the chat. And when you get to the end of it, it says, has there been much research with young people themselves versus adult voices that is focused on this question of acknowledgement and compensation? So Nicole, I know you did part of the literature review. Again, would you mind just making a few comments from that perspective? And then would really welcome maybe, Saria and Michelle, it might be a call for action. But Nicole, what would you say?
So in terms of has there been research, formal research, the answer is not a resounding no. There might be a few case studies that we found, but much of the research around this about acknowledgement and compensation have been headed by researchers sitting in research institutions or by clinical teams, as Kay pointed out in her presentation. A lot of the research on compensation with young people has come from the clinical context of participating in trials or experiments This area of working with young people as co-researchers, of understanding their lived and living experiences, of engaging in long-term projects is very new ground. There isn't much that we found in terms of the peer-reviewed literature that has focused on young people's voices. That being said, this working group of ethics in the ICCRP is looking more closely at that. We're trying to understand all those different points of troubling the waters on what we mean when we use these terms and getting young people involved and also sharing their understanding of it. So, Sarah, I'm sorry, there is no clear-cut answer, but that's just to say that this is a really new ground for having young people involve and join those conversations.
And hot news flash, there are 2 questions that have come in quite quickly. Monica thinks we have time. Maybe even just one of the panels wants to give a go. But maybe just invite, I see Kath Larkins, who's just joining our ethics working groups on the call. I know she's also done some recent reviews and stuff. If anybody wants to put in what they know about research from children and young people on these things, do share. But okay, so somewhat quick. Does anybody want to take Ava Jesu's question, which is what would be the best practices for justifying compensation to an ethics committee? Tricky. Anybody on the panel want to take it?
Well, gracias. Sí, muy puntual. Pienso que una de las mejores prácticas, más cómo escoger la práctica, porque creo que todos estamos de acuerdo que depende mucho del contexto, del tipo de investigación, del tiempo de investigación, etcétera, etcétera. Pienso que es en base a qué vas a escoger la práctica y considero que eso debería estar desde un enfoque de derechos y que pueda garantizar una igualdad de oportunidades en los participantes, ¿no? Que los participantes, al ser compensados, cuenten con las mismas oportunidades de participación. Tal vez el cómo se va a hacer todavía es algo que tenemos que descubrir, pero pienso que a eso debería apuntar la investigación con niños vinculado a la compensación.
Thank you. Obviously we could go on, but shall we just try to do a little bit to Katie's actually quite thought-provoking question? If we don't mind, Michelle, popping that into the chat as well to make sure everybody can see, but maybe start with our last one. If there's not a large budget, but worthy research, would it be ethical to continue if children do want financial compensation, but there's no funding for it? Saria, would you mind giving your immediate response? Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is a really tricky situation. I feel like ethics is important to consider here, but I think in this sense, would it be ethical? It wouldn't really be the question, in my opinion. I feel like you would have to have a clear and transparent conversation with the youth. Like, for example, a research project I'm on right now, they made it very clear that there is no financial compensation for it. But I was okay with that because I was compensating in another form, even though, like, yes, it would have been nice to have that financial compensation. They were like, Nicole and I talked about earlier, we came up with a contract for how I would be satisfied even without that financial compensation. So maybe there is a room for like negotiating with the youth. Like, yes, like ethics is something to consider, but I feel like in this sense, there are other options if you like are willing to sit down with the youth, be transparent and talk to them about how else might they be satisfied with their work in the co-research opportunity.
Well, I think that is a wonderful end to the panel. So thank you for doing that. And it circles back as it would make sense in this field that we all want to be engaging much more with children and young people and finding out what they think. And it's the negotiation. And I saw Kath replied, in a sense, there is the diversity of children and young people. And part of it is just to include, continue these intergenerational dialogues. Tara would be very impressed for me to mention that word in terms of the ICCRP and beyond. So I'm trying to elegantly hand over to you, Monica. Do you want to bring us to a close?
Sure, it will be a quick closing, and I'm happy to see the questions that were coming. Certainly, this is an ongoing conversation and much that researchers need to, do thinking about with young people who are also researchers, I have to say, so adult researchers. So in wrapping up, I'd like to, well, first thank all of the panelists, the presenters. Thank Michelle profusely for all the support. The chat has been active, and it's thanks to the care and attention you put into that, and Stephen also helping us behind the scenes, and the ICCRP more broadly. And of course, thank you to all of you for participating, for asking questions. And I hope that you will come away with some new ideas and the reinforced determination to keep this dialogue going and to take action. We got some examples, contracts, or whatever ways. Certainly keep talking about it with young people who are involved in research. I hope that's at least a takeaway for everybody. As we mentioned at the beginning, the recordings of the webinar, not only this one actually, but all the webinars this week will be posted on the ICCRP website in the coming weeks for everyone to see, so please check back. And we have, as Tara mentioned, an intergenerational advisory committee roundtable on Saturday coming up. As Michelle just posted, you can register and join us. We are trying to learn and be a reflective group, so there will be a survey that will pop up as you leave us today. If you can take a minute, it will really not take long to let us know what worked and didn't work and ways we can do better next time. We would really appreciate that. And with that, I'll wish everybody a great day, afternoon, night, from wherever you're joining us. Thank you to the panelists. That was wonderful. And we'll keep talking. This is only the beginning of the conversation. Thank you, everyone.